Statements such as these represent drastic shifts from Cleve Jones's previous activist experience in San Francisco with Harvey Milk. Elements of his changing activist style correlated with changing elements in American culture. Referring to his shifting activism and the shifts in American culture, Jones wrote, "Certainly I wanted to startle middle America and shake them up, but shocking people, hollering, 'Look out, America, we're coming,' just didn't work. Times had changed, and the quilt was part of the way we would survive and possibly prevail." In determining exactly how times had changed in ways that would encourage Jones's modified brand of activism, it's important to consider the shifting notions of identity politics in the 1980s. In the 1980s, the radical and widespread activism of the 60s and 70s, perhaps most noticeably the civil rights and feminist movements, stagnated in many respects. As the baby boomers graduated from college and settled down, they often lost their anti-authoritarian zeal and became increasingly materialistic and nationalistic. One small, but I think important indication of this in popular consciousness was a 1984 poll that found that 2/3 of voters were concerned, quote unquote, that people saw themselves first and foremost as part of racial or religious minorities instead of as a patriotic American. President Reagan echoed this sentiment when he professed his support for a special interest group that has too long been neglected, we the people, this breed called Americans. In Reagan's formulation, who counted as an American was certainly not all-inclusive and consistently excluded gay men and women and people with AIDS. Jones' effort to highlight the American identities of people with AIDS played to and subverted this discourse. While Jones certainly did not support Reagan's formulation of who should be included amongst this breed called Americans, he did appropriate the popular Reagan-era notion that American identity itself was important and should be upheld and esteemed, but included gay men in this notion, thereby also subverting Reagan's more exclusionary model. But while including gay men in this national identity was in some ways subversive, I argue that in other ways it solidified a nationalism that rested on defining who counted as an American and who did not. While ostensibly Jones included men and women of all races and classes in the quilt, in his memoir about the quilt, he never acknowledged the gendered, racial, and economic inequalities that contributed to the spread of HIV and the inadequate HIV-related care so many people, especially poor people and people of color, received. Jones did, on the other hand, pay significant attention to the effects of homophobia on HIV/AIDS. While I agree that Jones's claims to include gay men in a national identity were especially important for certain gay men and were politically very important and savvy given the time period, the limits of Jones's supposedly inclusionary model are significant. Jones's discourse around the quilt and the medium of the quilt itself, though ostensibly including all Americans, only significantly attempted to include white, middle-class gay men into a still exclusionary nationalism. And furthermore, by consistently framing AIDS as an American epidemic, Jones did ignore the global dimensions of AIDS and in turn the ways in which global capitalism and racial inequalities disproportionately impacted poor people and people of color in the United States and abroad. This is not to diminish the horrible oppression and discrimination white gay men have faced in U.S. history, especially at the hands of the federal government, or the critical challenges that the quilt made of American identities. Furthermore, it is important to acknowledge that at the level of the individual panels, the quilt did astonishingly important work in allowing for the psychic work of grieving, individualized representations, and memorializing. However, the quilt also contains what art historian Flavia Rando has called the willful construction of community, and we need to be critical of what the demarcations of this community were. So despite the important individual memorializing and mourning the quilt enabled, Jones's appeals for including gay men amongst the Americans often rested on strategizing on his white male middle-class privilege and made a problematic and exclusionary claim that the so-called general population should care about people with AIDS, not because they are simply people, but because they are Americans. One of the ways in which Jones highlighted the American identities of people with AIDS, especially gay men, was in the medium he chose, a quilt. Jones considered it a particularly American folk art and a symbol of solidarity, of family, and community. During the nostalgic 1980s, quilting became especially popular. For example, between 1984 and 1990, membership in the American Quilters Society jumped from 1,000 to 70,000. However, the history of quilting is more contentious than most nostalgic popular conceptions acknowledged. Until recent decades, quilting was considered the anonymous chore of women. However, in the 1970s and 80s, as interest in women's history expanded, historians have recognized the artistic achievements of women quilters as well as their political intentions. The women who made quilts in the 19th century often used quilting as a medium to express their political opinions on topics such as Civil War relief, abolition, temperance, and suffrage, as they were otherwise excluded from the political realm. While these quilts do demonstrate women's opinions on political issues, they also remind us of their exclusion from the public sphere and lack of political rights. Furthermore, popular accounts of quilting, including Cleve Jones's, often ignored African American women's heavy involvement in quilting, especially during slavery. In fact, women of all classes and races participated in quilting in the U.S. in the 19th century. However, few records of quilting by poor white women or women of color have been preserved. Given the politicized history of quilting and the nostalgia for it as a traditional American folk art, the quilt is a particularly interesting medium for the Names Project. It played to the nationalistic nostalgia of the Reagan era, while also more subtly invoking, but discursively ignoring, histories of subversive political statements in times of political exclusion and oppression. The quilt medium also played with and against notions of masculinity and femininity that in some ways challenged highly problematic stereotypes about gay men, but also invoked notions of a nuclear heterosexual family unit that may have placed limits on queer expression. In explaining why he chose a quilt as the medium for the Names Project, Jones wrote, "That it was women who did the sewing was an important element. At the time, HIV was seen as the product of aggressive gay male sexuality, and it seemed that the homey image and familial associations of a warm quilt would counter that," end quote. The quilt was successful in challenging the stereotype that Jones identified. It showed that gay men could come together in acts of love and community and create a gentle expression of love. I am interested, however, in how a feminist reading of the quilt as a medium sheds light on the potential limitations of this medium. In Jones's formulation, these memorials of men hinged on the work of women, both literally and metaphorically. While many gay men came together to make panels, a significant proportion were made by women, especially mothers, sisters, and lesbian community members. Just as an aside, some have argued that there are panels made for women, but as I said before, I think while we can read specific panels, it's also important to get sort of zoomed out official discourse version, and so I find it sort of insignificant to my argument that there are specific panels for women. So as I said, these panels were mostly made by women. While women did the behind-the-scenes work, men were publicly recognized and remembered. This problematic feminine-masculine dichotomy resonated with the antiquated and politically exclusionary notion of the gendering of the public sphere and private sphere. Though Jones was perfectly comfortable appropriating the non-threatening notions of femininity, he failed to respond to the sexism that shaped HIV/AIDS discourse and practice. During the first decades of the AIDS crisis and beyond, women died faster of AIDS, were excluded from clinical research on AIDS, and were denied benefits based on AIDS status due to the male-centered CDC definition of AIDS that did not acknowledge certain vaginal infections as HIV-related opportunistic infections. Furthermore, the high rates of violence against women and the lower socioeconomic status of women further limited women's access to HIV-related treatment and care. The quilt relies on notions of women as mothers and caretakers while ignoring the way HIV infects and affects their own bodies and lives. Jones failed to respond to the sexism that allowed for the continued spread of AIDS among women, especially women of color, and instead relied on stereotypical notions of idealized women to create the Names Project. Though the medium of a quilt did challenge certain stereotypes about gay men, it may also have placed limits on the range of queer expression in the quilt. Flavia Randall, a feminist art historian, wrote that Jones's relatively common misunderstanding of the history of quilting must lead us to consider the paradigms of gender and heterosexual relations encoded within such mythical ideas of family and community. Rando argued that the medium of the quilt reinscribed maternal notions into the quilt, in turn reinscribing heterosexuality and more traditional notions of masculinity. Many individual panels were very openly gay or queer and challenged conceptions of traditional masculinity and heterosexuality. For example, displays of leather fetishes or cross-dressing. However, as I've argued already, we need to look at the constructed community of the quilt as a whole in addition to reading specific panels. As the quilt was represented in official discourse, the quilt made appeals to mothers and relationships that resonated with heterosexuality. For example, Jones said he wanted the grandmother from Iowa who hand-stitched her boys' flannel shirts together to be comfortable enough with us to come and see the panel.